Welcome to Music Loop Podcast, brought to you by ASME SA Chapter. This is your very excited, happy, friendly podcast host, Chris Narraway. Music Loop is a podcast for people who want to reach out, connect and be inspired. Music Loop is designed to create a connection point for educators to support their involvement with music education. Whether you are a classroom practitioner or music specialist, this is an opportunity to reach out, offer support to others, ask questions and take action. Get involved in music education.
My guest today is an award-winning educator and tireless advocate for music education. She is a researcher and author in the field of brain development and music learning. She is internationally recognised for her unique work in translating the scientific research of neuroscientists and psychologists for the everyday parent, teacher and student. Anita's music advocacy work in the last few years has opened many of the often firmly shut doors of education bodies across Australia and encouraged them to look again at music education as a critical part of life and learning in schools. Welcome, Dr Anita Collins.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's lovely. It's lovely to be able to speak to you. I've seen you on the TED Talk that you've done, and I think you've probably done a couple actually, but the major one, and so I have an idea of what you look like. Although we're doing this by telephone because of, well, obviously because of the virus, and you're in Canberra and we're here in South Australia.
Yes.
So, Anita, you've got lots of exciting things that have happened in your life. You just have to Google you and you can find out lots and lots of stuff. But where did it all begin? Tell me about Anita as a little girl.
I was a chatterbox. I think as a child and a student, I had an interesting journey because the first part of my school life was I was very enthusiastic about school and I really loved learning and it was really great, but I had this little problem in that I really, really struggled to read. And it's not that I couldn't read at all. I could. It was a really big jumble for me. And I spent a lot of my time in my first couple of years at school actually hiding that I couldn't read and picking up signals and watching people's reactions really, really closely to figure out if I got things right. And a real turning point came when I was handed an instrument, but I think more importantly, I'm starting to learn that this is what may have happened, is that I learned how to read music, and music reading is a symbol to sound system, which means we look at a symbol and we hear that sound in our head and then we make that sound. And it's exactly the same process when we read music and play music as it is when we read words. And for some reason, I could pick up the reading of music a lot more easily. And I think it is because it's got a whole bunch of simple rules and the rules don't change. Whereas when I was trying to read English, I was struggling because there was like rules, but then you could break the rules half the time. So something happened and I started to read music and I flew with it. It was suddenly something I was good at and I felt suddenly confident again as I was as a learner, and it just changed my whole demeanour. But what happened probably 6 to 12 months after that is I found that my reading actually all the pieces started to fall in together and I could actually read confidently and not have to do all this really hard work of picking up if I'd done it right or picking up, figuring out other ways of understanding if what I'd read was correct. And since then, that's essentially something that really quite changed the course of my life, because if I'd continued as a student to really, really be struggling with reading, I would have had a very different school life than I have now. That I was going to have with having learnt music. And I think the reason why I continue to study and I've done right up to the end of, I've done a PhD and I can't really go much further, is because I'm trying to prove to myself that I can read and that I can understand written language. And it's just a fascination for me about what might have happened when I was very young that connected reading and music together. So as a student, I was very affable, was very chatty, and I tried really, really hard, but I was sort of hiding something for a little while, which which kind of, I think, got helped and fixed by music.
Fascinating. It's one of those happenstance things, isn't it? And as you say very rightly, if you hadn't had the opportunity to learn music and to read music, your life would have been completely different. And we all know those children that struggle with literacy and how life is quite difficult for them. Who gave you that piece? Who set you on that music path?
Well, I had a musical family. So my dad learnt violin when he was young. He was in a choir. Mum learnt piano. But I started learning organ, and I found that really, really hard. We had one of those sort of stand-up organs at home, and I found that really hard, and I think it was because of the two hands. It was just too much for my brain to cope with at that time. But we had this, and it still exists, still a fantastic program called the ACT Instrumental Music Program, which has a school band that starts in every public school sort of at year 5, and you get tested in year 4. And I happened to be able to do that. Only 30 of the kids out of the year group got to do it. I was selected to do it mainly, I think, because I was very, very conscientious, rather than having hugely high grades. And yeah, I was really lucky that they sort of started me on that sort of band learning experience where you just learn all together. And then I had a funny experience. They looked at my mouth and they looked at my body and they went, "Oh, I tried you out and said, we think you're a flute player, so off you go and get a flute from the storeroom." And then when I got to the storeroom door, the person said, "There's no more flute player, but here's a clarinet, try this." And as it turns out, I'm far more physically suited to a clarinet than I am a flute. And it just sat with my body really well. I found it really easy right from the start. And the learning experience in the band was really good, but I also had private instrumental lessons, and I think that's the thing that let me just fly. And I loved it, and it was finally something I was good at, and I worked really hard at it to continue to be good. It was my sort of turning around as a student to be, I'm actually good at something, and I'm going to go with this because this is making me feel great as a learner.
Was this a typical experience of children of your generation, I suppose, in Canberra, that they got... I mean, I've never heard of anyone being physically suited to an instrument. I've heard of people being physically suited to a sports, type of sports, but not to a musical instrument. And the fact that you had choices as well, to me, I find that is that unique? Is that fairly?
No. Well, the system was set up, and there's a few that are similar around Australia, where in the ACT anyway, the way it was set up at the time was one school would have a woodwind program, so there'd be clarinets, flutes, oboes, bassoons, and they'd have a band that was made of that, and then the neighbouring public primary school would always have a brass program, so they would always have trumpets, trombones, tubas. And then the reason they did that is that because two schools who were really close to each other could come together and make a proper kind of concert band arrangement and could play really easily together. So it was a really, really nice model. And I think when I think about the physically suited part, as a music teacher now, I can look at a child and probably go, you're suited to this instrument and not that instrument from a physical point of view. If I think about when I went to university and we had the flute class, they were all very tall. They all had very long fingers, very long limbs. They had a certain look about them. It's like, yes, they're a flute player. And then the clarinet class used to be next door, and we were all shorter, and we all have shorter fingers, which actually work really well with the clarinet with racing around. They're wider fingers, so they work really well on the pads, and it's just a different body type. And you could walk around. I could see around all the different groups and go, yeah, there's a physical body type that suits that kind of elite level of playing. But it's also, when I talk to parents as well, they say, well, what's the best instrument for brain development? I said, well, there's no best instrument. There's just the instrument that your child has fallen in love with. And that could be how it feels, that could be how it sounds, that could just be how it looks. It could be all of those. But it has to be that sort of deep connection that kids kind of get with an instrument. that often is the way that they choose it, or they all play the same instrument, and that's a really good way of it's a leveller, I find, in school too.
So how does a parent, how does a child choose an instrument if they don't have access to different instruments?
Yeah, and that's the hardest thing, and one of the things that for me is very important, that we find different ways to help kids have access. They actually need to not just look at pictures of instruments or look at YouTube and say, do you like this instrument or that instrument? They have to physically hold it, and they have to have the opportunity to play into it, and they have to see, it has to be a real experience, an experience with the instrument that means that they are connected with it. And you can't do that by YouTube, or you can't do it by a picture. You have to hold it, you have to play it, and you have to see which one suits you, because it's really interesting. You watch kids I watch kids go around and they say the different brass instruments, and they look at the trumpet and they go, oh yeah, and they look at the trombone and they go, oh yeah, but then they see a tuba and they go, oh, I like that, for whatever reason. And then if they play it and the sound comes really easily, that's another sort of tick in the box of I really love this, because music learning is a really hard road, and you get it wrong far more often than you get it right. So you have to really have a love for the instrument, because it's actually going to be quite hard, and it's that original attraction to the instrument that I think helps kids through those hard times when they go, I just can't get it right. What am I going to do?
So that gives them some stickability, if you like.
Yeah, absolutely. Very important engagement.
So to get back a little bit, you found what instrument? You found the clarinet.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that was your thing. It sang to you. It was something that you felt really good about having. And so where did you go from there? What happened next?
So we had the primary school program, which I was part of, and as an extension of the ACT instrumental program, they had these sort of auditioned groups that you could get into, which would bring together kids from all over the city, and you could play sort of heart of music, and they had some tours and things like that, and that was a real extension for me, because that was something I absolutely aimed for. So I played in my school band, and then I played in the band that sort of came out of all the school bands. So I did that in primary school. I continued through that in high school. But then I also started to get the opportunity to play in the Canberra Youth Orchestra as well, and to tour with them. And so there was lots of experiences outside the school environment for me that were really important, and lots of community music programs that provided me with that sort of excellence that I kept aiming for, kept going and going and going. And then I made a decision, that hard decision when you get to sort of the end of secondary school of, what are you going to go and study? And I was very lucky, and I think because of what music had given me, but also being really, really conscientious. I was one of those students, but I had friends around me who were even more conscientious. So I had a really great peer group who were super smart girls and have gone on to do incredible things, but they really pushed me academically as well. So I got a mark where it's kind of the mark at the end where you go, well, you could do anything. What do you want to do? And I had some really funny reactions. I said, well, I actually want to go and do music. And people go, why are you going to waste the opportunity to go and do medicine or go and do law or go and do something else to go and do music? And I thought the word waste was so interesting. Like, why is it a waste? Why do people see it like that? And I said, well, I have to do music now because I'm at this particular level and I have to see how far I can go and if it's what I want to do. And I know I have the capacity to do other things if music isn't the thing that I really want to do as a career. So I chose to do a performance degree at the Canberra School of Music. That was really hard. And I loved it, but I think I still remember the moment in about third year, it was a 4-year degree, when I just said, this is not actually the life I want. I love that I've been able to take my performance music to this incredibly high level, and I was starting to perform professionally and all that sorts of other things, but it just wasn't the life I wanted. It wasn't a lifestyle I wanted. It wasn't the life I wanted. And I think it's because I could imagine myself doing many other things rather than the only thing I could imagine myself was doing music.
So
I did.
Yeah. So you didn't want... It became... I'm interested how hard... What made it so difficult? What made it... Was it the fact that it was just focused on the one thing?
I think well, when I say it was hard, I think... I don't know how to phrase it, but I was still aiming for being the best. And I still do. At whatever I do, it's kind of like, I have to do this really, really well. And that's that perfectionist nature, which, as a classically trained musician, is really, really beneficial. Incredibly beneficial to pushing you towards levels of playing that you never thought were possible. But I wanted to be the very best of the best of the best. The thing is, I was surrounded by the best of the best as well. So I just found it constantly just really, really hard work. I learnt a lot of things. Although I'd never do it, I almost wish I could go back now and do it again, because what I've learnt about how to practice, how to learn, how to think about things differently would change how I approached doing a music degree. But I was just trying to be as good as I possibly could be. And for me, I feel like I achieved it, but I also said I don't want to spend another 10 years in a practice room practicing, because I can see myself doing so many other things. And strangely, or maybe serendipitously, all the way through my degree, I didn't have a job like a bar job, or I didn't work in retail. I didn't do anything else. All I did was teach clarinet, and I was teaching 40 or 50 students a week, and I was loving it. And it kind of dawned on me when I finished my degree, put my instrument down, I went, I love that experience, but it's just not for me. That I sort of searched around for what I wanted to do next. And my mum was a primary school teacher, and they'd always said, teaching's a good idea. And then I thought, well, actually, all the way through my degree, I've been teaching. So how about I go and do a graduate diploma of education? At the time, it was only 1 year long, and see what I think while I'm trying to decide what else I want to do. And I still remember, I was third week of university, and I was in a lecture learning about how to teach music, and I went, this is exactly where I should be. This is my place in the world, and this is what I'm going to do. And nothing has changed since that point.
Oh, wow. I love those stories. I think it must be such a fulfilling, wonderful thing to suddenly realise that this is the path that you want to be on, and that sense of excitement and in some ways relief, I guess, that this is it.
It's nice to find a vocation, not a job.
Yep.
It's nice to say this is my place to make a difference in the world. And funnily enough, although a lot of people sort of see me as being part of music and all those sorts of things, I'm actually a teacher, and music is my tool to teach human beings, to raise productive human beings to go out in the world and do whatever they want to. So one of the things that my book that's coming out that taught me is that actually it's about celebrating teaching. It's about celebrating the act of educating, which has become the most important thing for me. Music's just my tool through which I do it. And
I can hear in your voice that passion is still there, obviously, because you wouldn't have been doing what you've been doing for the last how many years since you did that?
Many. A few decades.
Right. And in that time, once again, we go back to what's written about you. You've done lots of writing. You've got a set of music resources for teachers. You've got and your book that we want to hear about as well. So how did you? So you came out. You'd done your music education, succeeded at that. You'd had that eureka moment where you were doing your education degree. Where did you go from there?
So in the 1 year course, there were 2 practicums, and my second one was at the school that I'm still at, strangely. And so, I had that, and they needed a teacher. So I was one of those incredibly lucky people who got my first full-time job out of my last part of university. So I just basically, I finished my prac on the Friday, and I was employed on the Monday to teach full-time. So I was very, very lucky. It was my school is Canberra Grammar School, and at the time it was an all-boys school and had been for 80-odd years. So very, very, as a young teacher, 23, 24 I was, young female teacher, it was a very, very interesting environment to come into as a teacher, because I was public school educated myself, and I hadn't experienced either a Catholic school education or an independent school education. So I had to learn very quickly about the culture of the school, but also the culture of an all-boys school. I'd been to co-ed school. So it was, I still remember my first year was the biggest learning curve I've ever been on. And, but it was great. And I was so lucky that my director of music is probably one of the most knowledgeable men I've ever known in terms of music. So he really upskilled me. Like, I was a classically trained musician and I had knowledge about that, but I still remember the first unit I had to teach my Year 10 class was jazz. And I didn't know anything. And it's like, hang on, to be a music teacher, you actually have to have this breadth and depth of knowledge, not just about the genre you went through and you were trained in. And that's such an interesting thing for me when I have then become a teacher educator myself and taken my students through that journey of, you're not a jazz saxophonist anymore, you're a music teacher of all of music, and how are you going to get your head around that quickly. So I started there, very challenging role. I took on everything I possibly could. About 4 years in, I recognised I did not know enough at all for the job that I wanted to do. So I started a master's from Deakin University, and that was in music. It's got a longer name, but it was basically in music education. And I did that by correspondence, and I did one unit a semester. So it ended up taking me 4 years to do. It took a really, really long time to do. But I used to just get up on Saturday mornings at 5 o'clock in the morning and go, right, this is my study time, and I would do my study. And I really loved doing that. And I was very, very lucky again. I've had so much luck with the mentors and the people who have just come into my life that have taught me so much. And I had Professor Robin Stevens, who's an incredibly he's an amazing researcher in music education. So he was my mentor at the end of my degree. And halfway through my master's degree, I said, I love Canberra Grammar School, but I need to see the world outside of that. So they actually, and I was very lucky, they gave me a year off to go and teach in England. And so I packed up my bags and I went and taught in England for a year in a very, very different kind of school.
Right. So you come from a school that is a private school, single sex, and you go to what in England?
I go to, I love describing this school. I love this school. It was called Bingley Grammar School, but it was what we would call a public school. Yeah. It's reversed in England. I was teaching in a building that on the outside of it had the date 1683, and I swear the roof was from 1683 because it leaked so much. And yeah, it was a public school. So it was called a comprehensive school. It was co-educational. I had 2,000 students in it. I had 39 or 40 students in every single class. It was packed to the rafters. The school itself was so small that when the bell went, with 2,000 kids in it, there was a one-way travel system. So you could only go out of your room and travel in a clockwise direction around this massive school building in order to get, even if your classroom was next door, you couldn't, literally because of the flow of humanity, you couldn't go the opposite way. And you had to go all the way around in circles. So it was such an amazing education to get my head around a new curriculum, a new style of teaching. I was in Bingley, which is in West Yorkshire, and if anyone knows what a West Yorkshire teenager sounds like,
goodness,
it does not sound like. I used to have this very funny experience where I would speak to them, and there was this like little gap where they kind of go, "Oh, that's what she said," and then they would talk back to me, and then there was me doing a little gap going, I think that's what they said, because they talk so quickly and they leave out lots of words. They leave out lots of conjunctions. Love them to bits. They were the best kids ever. And so it was taking my practice as a music teacher and like putting it in a vat of fire and going, now survive this. And I must admit, I came back going, I can do anything now. I can fix anything. There are no problems whatsoever. Because I went through that year, but they were amazing kids, but it was also quite an amazing professional experience to push me as a teacher to right to the edges of what I thought I could do and far beyond in many cases.
So I get the feeling that your experiences and your learning in Australia was in lots of ways transferable to a completely different culture. Is that correct? What I found so fascinating. So my father was British, and he came from Birmingham, which is south from Yorkshire. So I had that sort of what I thought was an understanding of British values, British culture. But of course, he left and came to Australia sort of in the 1950s. So when I went back, it was a very different England and a very different part of England, and I was amazed at how I had to be careful with the slight changes that culturally that I had to do, but also what fascinated me was about, I still remember before the kids arrived, I looked through their workbooks because they were in the classroom. And I was looking through going, these kids know so much stuff. Like they had lists of terms and they had notes and they had all sorts of things. Like, wow, this is really going to push me to teach them. But then I met the kids and I went, so I'm assuming you know all these things. And they go, no, we just wrote notes off the board. And so it was kind of like this experience of that's not, learning is what the child or the student can then speak back to me in their own words and start to identify things in music or whatever activity that we're actually doing, not about writing notes down. So that at that time, at that school, the sort of culture within the classroom was about knowing knowledge and knowing things, but not being able to apply them. Whereas when we were I came from a system in Australia where it was all about the application. It was all about you learn new terms just in time to apply them to the new piece of music that you're learning or that you're listening to or whatever, whereas these kids were reversed. And they looked like they knew a lot, but they had no way of listening to a new, unfamiliar piece of music and saying, well, I can hear this instrument and I can hear this compositional, technique happening here, or how do I approach that? It was like the polar opposite. And again, that had to push me very quickly to going, how do I assess where these kids are at? And then how do I help them transition from where they are to where they need to be? And I think that's now a process I continue to work with all the time. How do I help someone from where they are to where I think they need to be? So that methodology is very important. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. But also expectation of what does a learner look like and what can a learner do, and how do I know someone is learning? What does that look like? And what fascinates me is it looks different in every single person that I meet.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. So how do you go about, I'm struggling with this a bit because I'm not a teacher, and so do you start off with kids? Is it a basic premise that kids want to learn the music, that they've got this, or there's some reason why they're there? Is there does that have to be there to start with, or is it that's something that you can build in learners? That
Yeah, that's a fascinating question actually, is where do you need to start with already anybody? And I now see my students, everyone is my student, and also I am everyone else's student. So even the parents that I work with, they are my students. They are learning from me, and I am also learning back from them all the time. And part of it is, in order to learn, I don't think it's about liking music or liking history or liking physics. It's being curious about the world and about knowledge and about new things. And there's this element in, they do this test in psychology and they use what are called the big 5 personality traits. And one of them is called openness to experience. And when I love it because first of all, they've found that musically trained kids have this personality trait in a really high way. Like it's the one that's identified as the highest across the big 5. So this openness to experience. And when I think about in anything from a kindergarten child about going, what's that instrument? How do they make that sound? That's an openness. They're very open to experience. But as we get older, and sometimes our students get a little bit too obsessed with assessments and a little bit too worried about that, they stop that openness to experience. It's all about how do I get the highest marks I can. And that, I think it doesn't matter what anyone wants to learn, and it could be as we grow into adults, we want to learn a new skill, or we want to learn more about ourselves, or we want to learn more about another country. It's that openness to experience, to go somewhere or to read a book or to engage in a really wonderful new kind of conversation that is important about learning. So I don't think it's about loving music first. The great plus we have with music is that music is such an old part of our brain. It sits in the oldest part. Our brain is different ages. It's grown at sort of different times to what we have now, and music sits in the very oldest part. So almost everybody, and not everyone, but almost everybody loves music. So starting from where that is and then learning more about it, and then dealing with all the things that come up along the way, like it's really hard, it's really frustrating, you don't always get it right, that's about the openness to experience, and that's about the learning process. So for me, it's about being open and curious and interested in the world.
So once those neural pathways are there, or they're there anyway, but once they're fostered and they grow, then the potential in that learner increases with that openness to learning.
Openness to experience tends to be one of the things that is sort of pinpointed as a key ingredient to ongoing lifelong learning. Because if we're not open to experience, then we're not open to doing new things or to learning new things or to thinking about something differently. So therefore, that's when the learning might stop. Now, not stop, but it sort of isn't used quite as much maybe. And the really interesting part is openness to experience something we're born with? Is it a personality genetic sort of thing? Is it what we observe in others, particularly in the first couple of years of life, or is it something that we consciously choose to do? And the answer is probably all three. So it's like anything I constantly learn about this field of study is that it's never a single answer. It's always how one thing impacts on another thing that leads to another thing. So it's all much more complex than we think, but that makes it more interesting.
And I think that we can recognise that in other people too, particularly kids, where there's that, I don't know what it is, it's an excitement, it's a brightness, it's something that you see and you think, how wonderful that is. Yeah. Yeah,
I see it. I look for it in all people of all ages, but to me, I describe it as a light behind their eyes. Something switches on and they go, ooh, I'm interested in that. And that to me is one of those people who has an openness to experience, but also is a really true lifelong learner.
So you come back from England with all this stuff that you've been learning, that you've experienced. What's the next step that you take?
The next step was I finished my master's degree, so I kind of split that. I did 2 years, then I went to England, then I came back and did 2 years. And then I was still teaching at Canberra Grammar, and I needed to stretch my wings a bit, and I could see I couldn't quite get that opportunity at Canberra Grammar at the time. So on a lark, a friend of mine sent me an ad for a lecturer in education. I don't think it was it wasn't in music education. A lecturer in music education at the University of Canberra. And I was in one of those moods where it's like, I'll just apply. I won't even get an interview, but I just need to do something. I was very much searching for what I needed to do. And I not only got an interview, I got the job. And I still remember I got the phone call about the job, and I was in the middle of a shopping mall. And they said, we'd like to offer you the job, and you did really well, and you'll start on this day. We'll send you the contract, all sort of stuff. And I remember hanging up the phone and going, oh my God, what have I done? Because, like, I don't know how to teach teachers. And at the time, you only needed a postgraduate degree, not a PhD, to teach in university. The situation has since changed. So, yeah, I started, again, on this field of education going, I don't know what I'm doing, but let's just give it a try, which is kind of a theme through my life. It's like, I don't know, but I think maybe I could do this. And again, first year through, it was such a learning process of what's the difference and what are the similarities of young adult learners, and what is the purpose of teacher education, and where do I fit in that journey for them. And again, it was just stretching my teaching. It was just going, you know how to teach, but here's a new cohort with a new focus in a new institution. Universities are so different to schools. And yeah, so I started doing that, and then I don't know quite how I did this, but I kept half of my role at Grammar at the same time as I did a full-time role at the University of Canberra. And that was very much negotiated. It was like, if Canberra Grammar still needed me, I had certain specific skills that are very, very hard to find. And so they said, look, if you can manage it between the work you do at UC and the work you do at Canberra Grammar, and it all balances and everyone's fine, everyone's happy, then that's great. And I actually continued to do that for the next 12 years. So when I stayed at University of Canberra, I did full-time. I ended up teaching not just music and arts education. I ended up teaching the generalist things like, can you take the secondary teachers through behaviour management? Sure, I can do that. Can you take the primary and secondary through assessment criteria and all those things? Sure, I can do that. So I ended up teaching lots of generalist units as well, and I was very lucky to also then be involved in doing sort of degree redesign, which is a really interesting experience too, and also doing accreditation, which is, it's, again, they're new experiences that I went through. So yeah, that's and during that time I did my PhD, I had a baby, I did a TEDx talk, and I did my TEDx video.
I'm exhausted just hearing.
Yeah. Can I say at this point, do not do this at home. This is not recommended.
Anita, I'll just, yes, so we're talking to Dr Anita Collins, and she's, I'm overwhelmed with how much you've actually done and what you've achieved in those years. But you've achieved more. Tell us a bit about Bigger, Better Brains. What's that all about?
So, Bigger, Better Brains, the name comes from my PhD. So my journey into a PhD was an interesting one. I'd always wanted to do one, but as I said, at university, when I first was employed, you could have a master's, and that equaled the requirement you needed. But then the legislation changed, and you need to have a PhD to teach at university. So, and they gave us time, because PhDs don't, just happen. They gave time for those things to happen. So I spent about 9 months. I got two pieces of advice when choosing a topic. And the first piece of advice was choose a topic that has been researched to death and just put your own spin on it and get it done as quickly as you can. Right. And the second piece of advice was choose something you're going to love as much at the end as you did at the beginning, and something that makes your soul sing. And I chose the second. Well, because I thought, what's the point? And it makes sense as an artist and musician. I think if I might have been an economist, I might have done the opposite. Who knows? But I spent about 9 months, and my process was I just read everything about music. It didn't matter what it was. I just read heaps of different research. And I was waiting for that moment where I read something that made me go, yes, that's what I want to do. That's what I want to research. Weirdly, it happened in the kind of opposite way. I read something and I was so incensed by the end of it that I went, I don't need to know those things, but I need to know all the other things. And it just happened to be in the field of neuroscience and music education. And then I went, yeah, this is what I want to do. So the reason I mention it is because my PhD is called Bigger, Better Brains. And then it's got a very long name after that about what it's actually about. But it came from, as I read all the research in neuroscience, I kept writing in the columns. I kept on going, musicians' brains are bigger, musicians' brains are better. And that's where the name came from. So after my PhD and after I'd made a decision that I loved teacher education, but I couldn't do any more in the space that I was in, that I would start an online community. And it already had been started from my TED Ed and my TEDx talk. There was already a global community of people who were following my work. And I wanted to try to, in a full-time manner, to actually go to translate the research and get it out to as many people as we possibly could. Because at the time, the researchers were doing what researchers do. They were researching, finding great stuff, but it wasn't being shared outside the research community. And I thought that was such a shame. And I thought that music teachers needed to know this research particularly. And I just decided that I wanted to find ways and develop the community around the world that we have that can share this research, and then find ways for them to share it in their community. So it really is just about working to produce content, to share things in such a way that people continue to engage, just like I do, with the research, and find the confidence and have the ways of sharing it with a parent or a school leader that really resonate with the school leader, and they can start to change the music education programs in wherever they are. So it's a desire to help music teachers all over the world to do an even better job than the one they already do.
And to give them the confidence that what they're doing is worthwhile, positive, all the rest of it.
Yeah, often it's not just the confidence, it's the why. Because what I found this research has given us is I know that if I teach this thing in a certain way, that the majority of my students will respond like this, and I know it works. But I had no idea before I read the research why it works. I just knew it worked. And I think there's a power in knowing why we do something in a certain way and also why it works, because then we can improve it even further. We can tweak it and change it just a little bit. But also when we've got that kid who we just don't seem to be able to reach, this research, for me, absolutely helps me understand that child a little bit more, how they're experiencing the world, and therefore how I can teach them better.
And I guess it was, in a way, you came along at the right time. Neuroscience, neural pathways weren't the buzzwords that they are now 20 years ago, were they?
No.
So it was the right time, and of course you had the passion and the way of getting that out there. And it's accessible, isn't it? I've looked at the website, and it really is, even for a layperson like me, I look at it and I think, oh, this is something that is accessible, that would be easy to hook into.
That's the whole idea of how do we make this accessible. And there's a real tension and a real danger that when you take research that is incredibly detailed and then you try and boil it down into 5 or 6 sentences, that you're going to lose, of course, some of the details. So how do we make sure that we're not just translating it and going, here it is. We're actually working very, very hard to upskill all the music teachers around the world to look at research and say, what questions do I need to ask here? Or what do they mean by music education? Or did they come to a conclusion that I agree with and reflects in what I currently do or what I currently do with my students? So it's actually, it goes both ways. It's sharing things, but it's also using that sharing as a way of upskilling music teachers in their practice so that they are able to teach better, but also so that when they see something come out in the news, they can ask the right questions and they can think about the validity and the credibility of what's being said, and then, what does that mean for them?
Excellent. And now you are an author. Well, you've been an author before, but this is a...
this is kind of like now I'm a real one. As opposed to one before.
I wasn't going to say that, but...
No, that's fine. I understand.
You have a book.
I do have a book, yes.
And the name of the book?
The book is called The Music Advantage, which is a title that came out of something in the research, which is actually called the musician advantage. They're trying to find out what advantages musicians have from a cognitive point of view, and if that advantage has come from music learning or if it has come from their predisposition for music learning, or if it's a combination. And as always, it's a combination of the two. But yeah, it's a book about the advantages of music learning, not just cognitively but socially, in every different kind of way that music can assist kids with their learning, which will then go on to assist them with their lives.
Wow. And is it a book just for professionals, or is it a book that I, as a grandmother who thinks music is fabulous but might have trouble convincing my children of that?
You are my absolute demographic.
Right.
Yeah, it was written so one of the most interesting experiences I had is I did 12 years of academic writing, and academic writing is a certain kind of writing.
Yeah.
And I had to... That's not how I speak and not how I communicate. And so I had to break out of it. So I actually gave myself a little project, and I wrote a very short book called The Lullaby Effect, which was trying to learn a new way to write and communicate. And I wrote it, and I did the first time, and I sent it to a friend, and he said, very tactfully, he's wonderful, he said, there's not very much of you in this. And I said, what do you mean? He said, just try something for me. Write as you speak and see what happens. And he kind of gave me permission. I rewrote the book, and I found this different way of communicating, which is very much about how we talk about music education. So a lot of the book is written around stories. So I share stories either that I've had experience with or people have told me about that kind of talk about music education and the experience of learning music, but then I weave in the science that goes in it, but in such a way that you can kind of go, oh, I see when I see this, that this is actually what might be happening in that child's brain or in that parent's brain at the time. So it's very much a door opener to anybody who's ever experienced music learning, has a child experiencing music learning, has, as yourself, really, really loves it, but are having trouble convincing members of the family to love it as well. It's very much just opening that door to what's it like to learn music and what changes happen for kids in all sorts of different ways through the action of learning music.
It sounds like a required part of every baby pack that you give out.
Absolutely. I've already got a number of principals who've written to me and said, I'm buying a whole staff set and it's going to be our professional reading for the year. And that just makes me so happy.
Wonderful. Oh, Anita, well, if your passion for the work comes through in your words, then I'm sure it's going to be an absolutely wonderful read and something that is totally accessible for lots of people.
Thank you very much.
Now, I just have some last questions that I want to ask you. So what resource or resources have you encountered in the last 12 months that supported you either professionally or personally and helped you grow in some way?
I read research every single day. So for me, what nourishes me in my field is very much reading about the science, but that's not everyone's excitement. I do read, and what's more, I listen a lot. I listen to a lot of audiobooks that talk about the nature of learning, the nature of change, all those sorts of things that happen. So a lot of the time I'll be reading a business book, just going, how do people change their minds? Or, so there's been things like This is Marketing by Seth Godin and Changing Minds by Howard Gardner. I've read Chris Anderson's TED Talks, which has been really good to understand it is a formula behind how you take such different people with such different personalities and areas of interest and create these 15 to 18-minute talks that are just mind-blowing. So I've really enjoyed that. And then Angela Duckworth's script is just one of my favourites in the whole world. So, yeah, I try and read lots and lots of different things. And I've usually got a book, a professional book and an audio book and then a fiction book all on the go at the same time. And I read across all of those different ones.
Wonderful. From a girl that struggled to read, and there you are, a voracious reader. How
Yeah,
lucky.
I'm continuing to try and prove it to myself.
You can do it.
Yeah.
Okay. The next question is, what statement, motto, saying would you have displayed in your school?
I think I couldn't have one. I'd have them all over the place.
Is there one particular person that you think, oh, the catch thing, I must remember that. I must sort of, have that in the back of my diary or above my bathroom mirror or whatever?
Yeah, I have this really funny experience with those. I often find these really great quotes and I write them down, but I immediately forget them. But then weirdly enough, they come out somewhere in some presentation and I can say them word for word, but you know what, they've all gone out of my head now. Yeah. But I think I love walking into schools and seeing the words. I actually find it fascinating to see if they do use lots of quotes on the walls or have lots of things around, or they have none at all. But I'm fascinated at the words, things like curious and excited and enthused and love and joy and frustration and all of those sorts of words sit in there that we can start naming how learning feels. And I think that for me, a lot of the time when I read a curriculum document, it's like, yes, but how's this going to feel when you do it? Because we are sensory beings and we start with our feelings. So shouldn't we start with some language around what learning feels like? And I often walk in, some of the best, most wonderful schools I walk into have those feeling words all over the walls in sayings or just, just posters and things like that. So there's not particularly one. I latch onto all sorts of things. So that probably doesn't answer your question, but
no, that's
something that has about feelings and learning.
And add those words that can start a conversation and start people thinking. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay.
But even actually, I'll add one.
Go for it.
Tell me more about that. So whenever someone says something to me and I find it fascinating and I do this funny thing where I tilt my head and I go, tell me more about that, because that's the moment where we start to explore. And that's an important step for me.
For the listener, you, and for the talker as well.
For sure.
If you could design your ideal whole school music program with no limitations of any kind, what would you like to see?
Well, it's not that different to what I see in some really, really amazing schools, but it would be every child, no matter what year group it is, starts the day with a little bit of music, whether that's singing together, whether that's doing a rhythm activity together, whether that's improvising in some way. And when I say start the day, I'm talking 5 to 10 minutes. It's just like, this is what we do at the start of every day. One thing it would do, it would synchronise, we know now, it absolutely synchronizes the neural pathways. It gets the brain it readies the brain for learning because it gets it sort of, it's kind of like a warm-up for the brain, but not in a way of warming up our muscles. It's actually warming up our neural pathways and gets us ready for learning. If we were able to do that, then our kids would leap into whatever their first lesson is in a far more effective way. They would also be in a better mood, and they would also have a higher level of social cohesion and a sense of that cohesion and inclusion that would happen. And it's the tiniest little thing. And it can be anything. It's not, I don't believe it should be one thing like all school singing or all school rhythm making or whatever. It's whatever suits. And if anything, variety is the best part of it. But it's like, this is our music time. I would love to see incredibly strong programs in K-2 or P-2, whichever, sort of, the 5, 6, 7 age group. And having, besides that, starting the day with a little bit of music, is having also music learning activities in a sort of awful kodai kind of way every single day, even just, again, for 10 minutes just before lunch or somewhere in the day, that is that consistent activating their brains and getting them to work really, really hard getting their brains to work really hard consistently throughout the day. And I know it'll set them up with really great cognitive foundations, and that's what we want to do. And then I go back and forth, should we have kids starting instruments in year 1 or year 2 or year 3? And I think it has to do with what works with the school, but they need to start an instrument in primary school, and they need to start an appropriate instrument for their age and their body somewhere between that year 2 and year 4 area. And they need to have, where possible, instruments that go home. They need to have a lesson every single week, even in a small group, and they need to have an ensemble, larger learning experience as well. And that needs to involve singing and moving and playing their instrument and reading music. And then it needs to continue into high school, and the whole system we have at the moment that we have in year 7 and year 8, which is tricky, which is from the Australian curriculum, which is about our arts being all treated equally. And we kind of have this, we get a little bit of all of them, we get a taste of all of them, but we don't get to learn them in such a way that it either helps us to learn the art itself or benefit cognitive development. So there's a tricky thing in there that if we're producing all these great instrumentalists who can sing and move and have great brain connectivity, we need to continue that into high school as well. And we need to also say at some stage, it's okay to stop. It's okay to focus if this is not something you want to continue with. If you've had your somewhere between 5 and 7 years of music experience, which is not hard if you start in kindy and you've got a little bit every day, if music is not the thing you want to continue to put a lot of time and effort into, then that's okay if we've also given you the opportunity to have those cognitive foundations through music, starting the day with music, having a little bit of appropriate, whether it's on an instrument, whether it's singing, whether it's clapping, whether it's moving, every single day, but just a little bit. It's kind of just like brain exercise. And we have all these brain breaks and we have all this brain training, but it's being looked at really closely, and it's not as effective as it says it can be, whereas we know that music learning can be. So why can't we just reallocate that time to an activity that the science is starting to support can be really great, not just for cognitive development, but social development, executive function development, language development. There's so much that it can give, as well as making the kids feel happy to be at school. And that shouldn't be dismissed, because that's the starting point. If they're happy at school, then their learning automatically will be more effective because they're happy children and they're happy to be in that place of learning, even when it's frustrating. So that's a long-winded way of saying music every day, music that's appropriate for the age, music that happens every single week, not just for one term and then go off and do something else, and it has to be on an instrument, and it has to have an ensemble and a lesson experience every week. That should be hard, shouldn't it?
No, not at all. And no, I'm serious. Actually, the bit about starting off your day, we want children to have breakfast. We want children to be active. Why can't we also want children to be exposed to and join in and contribute to music for that small amount of the day? When we want our children, all of us as parents and grandparents and whoever, teachers, to be able to give our kids the opportunities to be the best that they can. And to me, it's not Mount Everest. It should be accessible, at least that part of it. Anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And we do it with physical activity. A lot of kids, the very first thing they're doing is out and around the oval, go for a run and come back. And there's a lot of research that's showing that we should be warming up bodies and brains. Not that running doesn't warm up the brain, but it doesn't do that neural synchronicity, connectivity, consistency part that the music does. Why can't we put those two together and warm up the kids' bodies and their brains ready for learning, and see music as partly having that role, as well as learning the art form itself, which is vitally important. But why can't we see that as the start of every single child's day?
And it'd be nice if every single parent of every single learner asks that question of every single educator that they come on to.
Yep.
Last question. So what one big idea would you like the listener to take away from this podcast? Apart from all those lovely big ideas.
All those other ones. I think the biggest misconception that I think we need, and I hope the book assists with everyone understanding, the biggest misconception is that music learning is only for children who are interested in it, who show what we perceive as talent in it, or whose parents can pay for it. I think the biggest idea is, and we use this word, every child deserves music education, and I don't like that saying. I think we need to shift it around to say every child needs music education in order to create that cognitive foundation that means they can then go on to do anything.
Yep.
So it's not a deserve, it's a need, and it's not about producing someone who goes off and has a musical career and makes money from it and is a professional. It's about producing a productive human being who can then go out and make whatever choice they want to in the world, but we know they can do it from a very strong cognitive base.
Well, they're pretty strong words, and that's a really nice place to end this podcast. Anita, it's been such a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
I wish you all the best with your books, The Music Advantage, The Lullaby Effect, with the Bigger Better Brains website, and with all your work. Your passion comes through and it's totally contagious, and I just wish you all the best and lots of keeping doing what you're doing.
Thank you so very much. It's been lovely talking today.
Great. I'm Robbie Howard, and this has been Music Loop. Reach out, connect, and be inspired to be active in music education.
Music Loop has been brought to you by the Australian Society for Music Education, SA Chapter, and through the support of the Music Education Strategy Innovation Funding. You can subscribe to Music Loop, asmesa.libsyn.com, asmesa.libsyn.com. If you have any feedback or would like further information about this episode, you can connect with Music Loop via email, musicloop@asma.edu.au, or join the discussion on ASMA SA Facebook page. Show notes about how to connect and information about the episode are at asma.edu.au/SA. I'm Chris Narraway, and this has been Music Loop. Reach out, connect, be inspired.